My name's Dave. I'm 37, a cab driver by trade, a father by fate, and a soap opera enthusiast by accident. My life isn't what most people would call exciting, but it's mine. Every morning starts with the same ritual: a hurried breakfast, a glance at my daughter Lila's unfinished homework spread across the dining table, and a chorus of soap opera characters' voices echoing from the living room. Jenna, my wife of 12 years, has an uncanny ability to make folding laundry feel like a high-stakes drama while watching her favorite show. At first, I didn't understand her obsession with those over-the-top love triangles and betrayals. Why watch a perfectly good doctor turn into an amnesiac jewel thief when real life has enough twists and turns? But over time, the show's ridiculous plots and even more ridiculous characters grew on me. It wasn't long before I started asking questions like, did Dr. Larson really marry her evil twin, or how did Victor survive that plane crash into a volcano? You could say my life felt like one long commercial break compared to the soap opera Jenna loved so much. Driving my cab was predictable: routine pickups, chatty customers, and the occasional backseat drama that couldn't compete with what played out on Jenna's favorite show. But hey, it paid the bills and put food on the table. One evening, Jenna announced that we needed a change of scenery. She said this while folding a pair of my socks and glaring at the screen where an actress was delivering a tearful monologue to a man in a coma. It took me a moment to realize she wasn't quoting the show. What kind of scenery? I asked, knowing full well this wasn't just a casual observation. Jenna didn't do casual. Mountains, she said with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. Fresh air, open spaces, and no traffic. Traffic? That one stung a little. Traffic was my domain, my kingdom of endless red lights and honking horns. What about work? Lila's school, I offered, hoping practicality might derail this train of thought. It's summer break, she shot back, handing me a cup of coffee as if to soften the blow. And your cab company can survive a week without you. We need this, Dave. There was something in her voice, a kind of weariness I hadn't noticed before. Jenna wasn't the type to complain, not outright. But this was more than a request, it was a plea. I looked at Lila, who was busy doodling unicorns at the table, and then at Jenna, who had already started browsing vacation rental websites on her phone. All right, I said, relenting. Let's do it. Where are we going? Jenna settled on a little mountain town called Aspen Ridge. She found a cozy cabin rental with rustic charm, which I later learned was code for no Wi-Fi. This'll be good for us, she said as we packed. Lila, now armed with a sketchbook and colored pencils, seemed just as excited about the trip as her mother. I tried to muster enthusiasm, but the thought of being away from my cab, my routine, and, yes, my soap operas felt oddly unsettling. The drive to Aspen Ridge was scenic enough to distract me from the dread. Rolling hills gave way to jagged peaks, and the air seemed to get cleaner with every mile. By the time we arrived, I couldn't deny it, the place was stunning. Wooden cabins dotted the landscape, nestled among towering pines. A crystal-clear river wound its way through the valley, and the scent of pine and earth was so fresh it almost felt illegal to breathe. Our cabin sat at the edge of a meadow, with a view straight out of one of Lila's storybooks. Inside, it was all wooden beams, stone fireplaces, and mismatched furniture that somehow worked together. Jenna unpacked with a kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been dreaming of this moment for months. This is perfect, she said, standing on the porch and looking out at the mountains. Isn't it, Dave? I nodded, sipping a cup of coffee and letting the stillness sink in. It was perfect in the way a postcard is perfect, beautiful but not quite real. For someone used to the constant hum of the city, the silence felt almost too loud. Lila, however, was in her element. She darted around the cabin, pointing out every little detail like a pint-sized tour guide. Look, Dad, a fireplace. And there's a squirrel outside. Jenna smiled, watching her, and for the first time in a long time, she looked genuinely happy. This is going to be good for us, she said again, more to herself than to me. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip wasn't just about fresh air and open spaces. Something was off. I just didn't know what. As the first morning in Aspen Ridge unfolded, I couldn't help but notice how different the air felt. It wasn't just cleaner, it was the kind of air that demanded you slow down, breathe deeply, and forget, at least temporarily, that you owed 2 months on the gas bill. Lila was up early, already sketching the meadow outside, her face glowing with the kind of excitement only an 8-year-old can muster for nature. Jenna, for her part, was humming in the kitchen, brewing coffee in a pot that looked like it had seen its fair share of years. I took my cup out to the porch, letting the silence settle around me. No honking horns, no blaring radios from passing cars, just the occasional chirp of a bird. For a city guy like me, it was almost unnerving. But before I could sink too far into my thoughts, Jenna appeared, her face lit with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. "I booked us a tour for the afternoon," she announced. "Some local guide will take us to all the must-see spots. He's supposed to be great, knows everything about the area." I raised an eyebrow. All the must-see spots? How many could there possibly be in a place this small? She ignored my skepticism. "Dave, come on. Lila will love it, and it's good for us to get out and explore. You said you wanted to make the most of this trip, didn't you?" I hadn't said anything of the sort, but I knew better than to argue. By noon, we were packed into the car, heading to the town's small visitor center. Lila chattered excitedly in the back seat about all the things she hoped to see: deer, waterfalls, maybe even a bear. Meanwhile, I mentally prepared myself for what I assumed would be a long, tedious afternoon. The guide's name was Nathan, and he wasn't what I expected. In his mid-40s, with a weathered face and an easy smile, he looked like he belonged in one of those outdoor gear commercials. But it wasn't his appearance that caught me off guard, it was the way he carried himself, confident without being cocky, like he genuinely loved sharing his world with newcomers. "Welcome to Aspen Ridge," he said as we gathered around. "You folks picked the perfect day for this. Clear skies, good company, and plenty of sights to take in. Let's get started, shall we?" Nathan led us to a trailhead just outside of town, where the forest seemed to swallow us whole. Jenna stayed close to him, peppering him with questions about the trees, the wildlife, and the history of the area. Lila darted ahead, chasing butterflies and collecting leaves, while I lingered behind, trying not to trip over roots or embarrass myself by panting too loudly. But as the hike went on, I found myself warming to Nathan. He had a way of making you feel like you were part of something bigger, like every rock and tree had a story to tell if you just took the time to listen. He didn't just point out the sights, he brought them to life. "This spot here," he said, stopping at a small clearing, "is where the original settlers built their first cabin. They chose it because of the view." He gestured to the mountains beyond, their peaks sharp against the blue sky. "Imagine waking up to this every morning, knowing you had to carve out a life from nothing but what you saw in front of you." Jenna nodded, her eyes wide. "That's incredible. It must have taken so much courage." Nathan smiled. "It did. But they weren't just brave, they were also stubborn, maybe even a little crazy. Kind of like anyone who decides to settle in a place like this." He glanced at me, his grin widening. "What do you think, Dave? Could you hack it?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I can barely hack city life. Out here, I'd probably last a week." Nathan chuckled. "Fair enough. But who knows? You might surprise yourself." By the end of the tour, even I had to admit it had been a good day. Lila was thrilled with her collection of leaves and rocks, Jenna seemed lighter somehow, and I felt a little less like an outsider in this strange, beautiful place. As we said goodbye to Nathan, he handed Jenna a brochure. "If you're interested, I offer private tours too," he said. "Smaller groups, more personalized. Sometimes it's nice to have a little more time to really explore." Jenna thanked him, tucking the brochure into her bag. As we drove back to the cabin, she was unusually quiet, staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. I didn't think much of it at the time. If anything, I was just grateful she seemed to be enjoying herself. That evening, as Lila slept and I sipped a beer on the porch, Jenna joined me, her face soft in the glow of the porch light. "It's nice here, isn't it?" she said. "Yeah," I admitted. "It's different. But good different." She smiled, leaning against the railing. "I think we needed this. A break from everything." I nodded, not knowing what to say. The truth was, I didn't entirely understand what she meant. Everything had felt fine to me, ordinary, maybe, but fine. Still, I couldn't deny that something was shifting between us, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the stars came out, I wondered if this trip was really the reset Jenna seemed to think we needed, or if it was the start of something else entirely. The next morning, Jenna was up before me, which wasn't unusual during vacations. She liked to maximize her time in new places, while I preferred a slow start, coffee in hand, porch views on repeat. When I finally stumbled into the kitchen, she was already dressed, her energy unmistakable. "I booked a private tour with Nathan," she announced as I poured my coffee. "Just for me. Lila wants to stay and work on her sketches, and I figured you'd appreciate some downtime." I blinked at her, still half asleep. "A private tour?" "Yes," she said, matter-of-factly. "He offered it yesterday, remember? It's a chance to see more of the area, and he said there's this hidden waterfall that's just breathtaking. Besides, you could use a break." A break from what, I thought, but kept it to myself. Jenna didn't wait for an answer. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her bag, and headed out the door. Lila, who had been eavesdropping from the living room, peeked around the corner. "Can I have pancakes for breakfast?" she asked, already holding the syrup. "Sure," I said, though I was still processing Jenna's abrupt departure. The day moved slowly. After breakfast, Lila spread out her art supplies on the porch, determined to capture the meadow in perfect detail. I alternated between reading the paper and tinkering with the old radio in the cabin. By mid-afternoon, I started wondering where Jenna was. I wasn't worried exactly, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. She finally returned just before dinner, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly mussed. She looked happier than I'd seen her in a while. "How was it?" I asked as she breezed into the kitchen. "Amazing," she said. "Nathan showed me this little canyon with wildflowers everywhere. And the waterfall, it was like something out of a dream." She went on about the tour, describing every detail with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for her soap operas. I listened, nodding where appropriate, but the back of my mind was preoccupied. Something about the way she spoke about Nathan, his knowledge, his humor, his attention to detail, made me uneasy. Dinner was a quiet affair. Lila was too absorbed in her sketches to notice the strange undercurrent between Jenna and me. After the dishes were cleared, Jenna disappeared into the bedroom, claiming she was tired from the day. I stayed up, flipping channels on the old TV, but my thoughts kept circling back to the look on her face when she'd come home. The next day, Jenna announced she was going on another tour. This time, she didn't bother asking for input. "I'll be back in the afternoon," she said, planting a quick kiss on Lila's forehead and leaving before I could respond. The pattern continued. Every day, Jenna found a reason to spend hours away, exploring with Nathan. I told myself it was nothing, just her enjoying the trip, soaking in the scenery. But as the week wore on, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. One evening, as I stood on the porch with a beer, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, Lila came up beside me. "Do you think Mom likes Nathan?" she asked, her voice so casual it caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I said, trying to sound equally nonchalant. "I don't know," she said with a shrug. "She talks about him a lot. Like, a lot. And she smiles more now. Like the characters on TV when they're in love." I chuckled nervously. "It's not like that, Lila. She just likes the tours. That's all." Lila seemed satisfied with my answer and wandered back inside, but her words lingered. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was more to Jenna's new energy than just the thrill of vacation. The next morning, I decided to join them. Jenna looked surprised when I announced my plan, but she didn't argue. Nathan greeted me with his usual charm, unfazed by my sudden presence. As we hiked, I tried to focus on the scenery, but my attention kept drifting to Jenna and Nathan. The way she laughed at his jokes, the way he leaned in when she spoke, it was subtle, but it was there. By the time we returned to the cabin, I was exhausted, not from the hike, but from the effort of pretending everything was fine. Jenna seemed oblivious to my unease, chatting happily as she prepared dinner. Lila, ever the perceptive one, shot me a curious look but didn't say anything. That night, as Jenna slept soundly beside me, I lay awake again, the unease growing into something heavier. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was changing, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. The following morning, the air in the cabin felt heavier, as if the silence itself had gained weight. Jenna was already up, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea in her hands. She stared out the window, lost in thought. When she noticed me, she gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nathan mentioned another trail," she said after a long pause. "A different one, quieter. I thought I'd check it out today." I poured myself some coffee, watching her carefully. She avoided my gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her mug. "Are you sure you want to go alone again?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She glanced at me, hesitating for just a moment. "I think I'll get more out of it that way. You're not really into hiking, and Lila, well, she seems happy here." She was right about Lila. Our daughter had declared the cabin her art retreat and spent most of her time on the porch, capturing every bird and flower she could see. Still, there was something in Jenna's voice, an edge I couldn't ignore. "All right," I said finally, but my chest felt tight as the words left my mouth. When Jenna left, the cabin felt emptier than usual. Lila was humming as she sketched, oblivious to the tension swirling in my mind. I tried to distract myself with a book, then a walk around the meadow, but nothing helped. The unease was like an itch I couldn't scratch. Hours later, Jenna returned, her cheeks flushed from the cool mountain air. She was in high spirits again, her smile brighter, her voice livelier. She talked about the trail, the trees, the sounds of the forest, but there was a casualness to her words that felt rehearsed, like she was leaving something out. "How was it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Beautiful," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Just what I needed." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach tightened. It was as though she'd built a wall between us, and every word she spoke was another brick. The days passed, each one following the same pattern. Jenna's mornings were filled with plans to explore the trails with Nathan, while I stayed behind with Lila. She seemed to thrive in this routine, her mood lighter than I'd seen in years. But the more she glowed, the more I felt like a shadow, fading into the background. One evening, as we sat on the porch, I decided to address the growing distance. I watched her for a moment, the way her hair caught the golden light of the setting sun, before finally speaking. "You seem different," I said, trying to sound casual. She turned to me, her expression guarded. "Different how?" "Happier," I said. "But also, distant. Is everything okay?" She looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Of course, Dave. It's just, this place. It's nice to feel free for a bit. Away from the routine, the city, everything." Her words stung, though she hadn't meant them to. I wanted to ask, free from what? From me? But I stayed silent, afraid of the answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on me. The way she talked about freedom, the way she smiled when she mentioned Nathan, it all pointed to something I didn't want to confront. The next day, I followed her. I told Jenna I was taking a drive into town to pick up supplies, but once she left, I quietly trailed behind her, keeping my distance. The trailhead she chose was secluded, surrounded by dense trees that muffled every sound. I parked a little way off, hidden behind some bushes, and waited. She met Nathan at the entrance, his smile as wide and welcoming as ever. They talked briefly, their voices too low for me to hear, before disappearing down the trail together. I stayed in the car, my heart pounding, my thoughts racing. A part of me wanted to charge after them, to demand answers. But another part, an even stronger part, was terrified of what I might find. When they returned hours later, they didn't look guilty. Jenna was laughing at something Nathan said, her expression relaxed, carefree. They didn't touch, didn't linger. But there was something unspoken between them, something I couldn't ignore. Back at the cabin, Jenna acted as though nothing had happened. She kissed Lila on the head, asked me about my trip into town, and started cooking dinner. But I couldn't shake the image of her with Nathan, the easy way they moved together, like two pieces of a puzzle that fit too perfectly. As the evening wore on, the silence between us grew heavier. Lila went to bed early, sensing the tension in the air. Jenna sat by the fireplace, reading a book, but her eyes didn't move across the page. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Jenna," I said, my voice breaking the quiet. "What's going on?" She looked up, startled. What do you mean? You and Nathan. These tours, these hikes. It's like you're a different person around him. Her face softened, but she didn't answer right away. Finally, she sighed, setting the book down. Dave, there's nothing going on. He's just easy to talk to. That's all. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let it go. But something in her tone, in the way her eyes darted away from mine, told me there was more to the story. Understood. Here's a rewritten fifth part where Jenna's growing connection with Nathan crosses a boundary. The tone remains emotionally charged but subtle, emphasizing the internal conflicts and the emotional layers of the situation. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the cabin walls. Jenna was up early, dressed in her hiking gear, her movements quiet and deliberate. She barely spoke as she packed her bag, avoiding Dave's gaze. He watched her from the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "You're heading out again?" he asked finally, his voice calm but strained. She nodded without looking at him. "Nathan mentioned a trail that leads to a hidden lake. He said it's beautiful." Dave set his mug down, his jaw tightening. "Do you ever plan on taking me or Lila along on these hikes?" Jenna froze for a moment, her back to him. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of guilt passing across her face. "It's not like that, Dave. You don't even like hiking. And Lila's happy here, drawing all day. This is just something for me." "For you," he repeated, his tone flat. "Yeah, I've noticed." She sighed, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Please don't start. Not now." And just like that, she was out the door, leaving Dave alone with his growing unease. Jenna met Nathan at the trailhead, the crisp mountain air already working its magic to clear her thoughts. He greeted her with his usual easy smile, but today, there was something different in his eyes and intensity that both thrilled and unnerved her. "Ready to see the lake?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. She nodded, falling into step beside him as they started up the trail. The hike was longer than she'd expected, the path winding through dense forest and rocky outcrops. Nathan kept the conversation light, pointing out wildflowers and telling stories about the area's history. But every now and then, their hands would brush as they navigated the uneven terrain, and Jenna felt her heart skip a beat. By the time they reached the lake, the sun was high, its golden light shimmering on the water's surface. The scene was breathtaking, the kind of beauty that seemed almost unreal. Jenna stood at the edge of the water, her chest rising and falling with the exertion of the climb. "It's stunning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "It's even better with good company." She turned to look at him, her breath catching at the way he was watching her. There was something in his gaze, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling. "Jenna," he interrupted gently, his hand brushing against hers. "You don't have to say anything." Her resolve wavered. The air between them was electric, charged with unspoken words and possibilities. She knew she should step back, break the moment before it went too far. But she didn't move. When he leaned in, she didn't stop him. His lips found hers, warm and insistent, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. She kissed him back, her hands clutching his jacket as the floodgates of her emotions burst open. The kiss deepened, and Jenna felt herself giving in completely, drawn to the way Nathan made her feel seen, wanted, alive. They moved to the shade of a nearby tree, their touches becoming more fervent, their breaths mingling in the cool mountain air. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, they made their way back down the trail in silence. Nathan walked beside her, his presence steady but his demeanor quieter than usual. Jenna's mind raced with conflicting emotions, guilt, exhilaration, confusion. When they reached the trailhead, Nathan hesitated, turning to face her. "Jenna." She shook her head quickly, cutting him off. "Don't. I need time to think." He nodded, his face unreadable. "Take all the time you need." Jenna drove back to the cabin, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She replayed the day in her mind, every moment of it vivid and seared into her memory. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the guilt had settled deep in her chest, a weight she couldn't ignore. Inside, Dave was sitting on the couch, a book open on his lap but untouched. He looked up when she entered, his eyes searching hers. "How was the hike?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. Jenna forced a smile, her voice shaky. "It was beautiful." She turned away quickly, avoiding his gaze as she made her way to the bedroom. Once inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The reality of what she'd done hit her like a wave, and tears streamed down her face. She sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to reconcile the person she'd been that afternoon with the person she'd promised to be. The ache in her chest wasn't just guilt, it was the dawning realization that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The morning was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Jenna moved about the cabin with a distracted energy, barely acknowledging me or Lila. She had her hiking bag ready before breakfast, and while I tried to act casual, the unease in my chest had become impossible to ignore. "I'm heading out again," she said, her tone light but her eyes avoiding mine. "Nathan mentioned an old lookout point we haven't visited yet." This time, I couldn't hold it in. "Jenna, wait." I stood, blocking the doorway. "Don't you think you've been spending a lot of time with him?" She froze, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Dave, it's just hiking." "It's not what you think." "And what do I think?" My voice was calm, but my words carried a sharpness that made her flinch. She sighed, her gaze flickering toward Lila, who was sitting on the porch with her sketchbook. "Let's not do this now," she whispered, stepping closer so only I could hear. "Please, Dave." I didn't move. "We have to talk about this eventually." "Why not now?" "Because," she stopped herself, her voice cracking slightly. "Because I need this. I need a break. Just let me have this, okay?" Her words hung in the air, and I didn't have the heart to stop her. She brushed past me, her footsteps quickly fading down the trail. Lila looked up, confused. "Is Mom okay?" "She's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just excited for her hike." I tried to distract myself with chores, but the hours crawled by. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made me jump. By mid-afternoon, a storm began to roll in, dark clouds gathering over the mountains. Lila was on the porch, drawing the shifting sky, when the first raindrops started to fall. "Mom's going to get wet," she said, her voice tinged with worry. I nodded, my gut twisting. "She'll probably head back soon." But as the rain picked up, turning into a downpour, the unease in my chest became unbearable. Something was wrong, I could feel it. I grabbed my jacket and told Lila to stay inside. "Where are you going?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with concern. "To find Mom," I said. "Stay here and lock the door behind me." The storm was fierce, the wind howling through the trees as I made my way toward the trailhead. The rain soaked me to the bone within minutes, but I pressed on, calling Jenna's name. My voice was swallowed by the storm, but I didn't stop. Each step felt heavier, each minute stretching endlessly. It wasn't until I reached a narrow ridge that I saw her. Jenna's bag was lying on the ground, soaked and half open, its contents scattered. My heart pounded as I searched the area, my voice raw from shouting her name. Then I saw it, a flash of red fabric snagged on a jagged rock below the ridge. "No." The word escaped my lips as a whisper, carried away by the wind. I scrambled down the slope, slipping and sliding on the wet rocks until I reached her. She was lying awkwardly, her body partially obscured by the brush. "Jenna!" I dropped to my knees, shaking her gently. "Wake up! Please, wake up!" Her face was pale, her eyes half open but unfocused. A gash on her temple bled freely, mixing with the rain. I felt for a pulse, my hands trembling. It was faint, but it was there. Relief surged through me, but it was fleeting. She needed help, and fast. "Hold on," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I'll get you out of here." The climb back up the ridge with Jenna was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The rain made the rocks slick, and my arms screamed in protest as I dragged her inch by inch. I slipped more than once, the weight of her body threatening to pull us both down, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed, gasping for air. My vision blurred with tears and rain as I fumbled for my phone, dialing the emergency number with shaking fingers. "Help's coming," I told her, even though she couldn't hear me. "You're going to be okay." The wait for the rescue team felt like a lifetime. When they arrived, their voices were urgent but steady, their movements swift as they assessed Jenna's condition. I stepped back, watching helplessly as they secured her to a stretcher and began the long trek back to the main road. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room, my clothes still damp and my hands covered in dirt and blood. Lila was with a neighbor from the cabin rental, and I felt a crushing guilt for leaving her behind, even though I'd had no choice. Hours passed before a doctor finally approached me. His face was kind but serious, and I braced myself for the worst. "She's stable," he said, and my knees nearly gave out with relief. "But her injuries are severe. A concussion, a fractured rib, and a punctured lung. We've done what we can, but the next 24 hours are critical." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Can I see her?" He hesitated before nodding. "Briefly. She's sedated, but she might hear you." I entered her room, the beeping of monitors and the faint hum of machines filling the air. Jenna looked small and fragile, her face pale against the stark white sheets. I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. "You're going to be okay," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." As the storm raged on outside, I stayed by her side, the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me like a tidal wave. Whatever had been happening between us, whatever truths she'd been hiding, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was that she came back to me. The morning after the storm, the hospital room was eerily quiet except for the steady beep of the monitors. Jenna lay motionless, her face still as pale as it had been the night before. I hadn't left her side. My hand rested on hers, willing her to feel my presence, to open her eyes and let me know she was still there. The doctor's words replayed in my head like a broken record. "The next 24 hours are critical." I had clung to those words, hoping that if we could just get through this one day, things would be okay. But as the hours dragged on, hope felt like a fragile thread, fraying with every passing moment. Lila was with the neighbor, safe but confused. I hadn't told her much, just that Mom was hurt and needed to stay in the hospital for a little while. She'd cried, of course, begging me to bring Jenna home, and it had taken everything in me not to break down in front of her. By late afternoon, the storm had cleared, leaving behind a gray, overcast sky. The doctor came in again, his expression unreadable. He checked the monitors, adjusted a few settings, and nodded at the nurse before turning to me. "We've done everything we can," he said quietly. "She's stable for now, but there's been no improvement. If she doesn't wake up soon." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. When he left, I sat back down, staring at Jenna's face. Her hair was still damp from the storm, her lips dry and slightly cracked. She looked so fragile, so unlike the woman who had been hiking those trails just yesterday. I leaned in, my voice trembling as I spoke. "Jenna, it's me. I need you to fight, okay? For Lila. For us. Whatever this is, whatever we've been going through, we can fix it. But you have to wake up. Please." The machines beeped steadily, offering no response. My heart ached with the silence. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, but I barely noticed them. Night fell, and the room grew colder, though I couldn't tell if it was the temperature or the emptiness settling in my chest. I kept my vigil, refusing to leave, afraid that if I stepped away, she'd slip further away from me. Sometime after midnight, something changed. The monitors began to beep erratically, their once steady rhythm breaking into chaotic bursts. Nurses rushed in, their voices sharp and urgent. A doctor appeared moments later, his face tense as he barked orders. I was pushed back, out of the way, as they surrounded her bed. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What's happening?" I demanded, but no one answered. They were too busy, too focused. The scene unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The doctor's voice was urgent, the nurses moved with practiced efficiency, but none of it seemed to be enough. The beeping turned into a flat, unbroken tone, and my world seemed to shatter with it. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, no, no." The doctor looked at the clock, his shoulders slumping slightly. He said something to the nurse, then turned to me, his face etched with sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he said, "but we couldn't save her." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out as I collapsed into a chair. The room spun around me, the doctor's voice fading into the background as a numbness took over. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Just yesterday, she was laughing, her cheeks pink from the cold mountain air. She was alive. How could she be gone? I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think. When I finally found the strength to stand, the nurses had already cleaned the room, removing the machines and leaving Jenna lying peacefully on the bed. She looked as though she were sleeping, her expression calm, almost serene. I approached her slowly, my knees threatening to buckle with every step. Sitting beside her, I took her hand in mine, the warmth already fading from her skin. Tears streamed down my face, but I made no effort to wipe them away. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have known. I should have." The words dissolved into sobs, my chest heaving as the grief overwhelmed me. I thought of Lila, of how I would have to tell her that her mother wasn't coming home. I thought of the life Jenna and I had built, the moments we'd shared, the things we'd left unsaid. And I thought of Nathan, of the hikes, of the time she'd spent with him, and the questions I'd never get answers to. The grief gave way to anger, at myself, at Jenna, at the world for taking her away. But the anger burned out quickly, leaving only a hollow ache that I knew would never fully heal. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I leaned over and pressed a kiss to Jenna's forehead. "I love you," I whispered. "I always will." And then, for the first time since I met her, I had to let her go. The funeral was a small, somber affair, held in a chapel that seemed too quiet for someone as lively as Jenna had once been. Friends, neighbors, and a few extended family members came to pay their respects, their hushed whispers and sympathetic glances feeling like daggers. I stood beside Lila, who clung to my hand, her face pale and tear-streaked. She didn't say much, just stared at the casket with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She was too young to grasp the full weight of what was happening, but she understood enough to know her world would never be the same. Nathan came, standing near the back, his presence filling me with a bitter mix of anger and confusion. He didn't approach, didn't try to speak to me, but his face carried a guilt I didn't want to examine too closely. After the service, he disappeared before I could decide whether to confront him or let it go. Back at the cabin, the silence was unbearable. Lila sat curled up on the couch, her sketchbook untouched on the table. I stood by the window, staring out at the meadow Jenna had loved so much. Every corner of that cabin held a memory of her, her laugh, her smile, her voice. It was too much. "We're leaving," I said suddenly, my voice breaking the quiet. Lila looked up, confused. "What?" "We're going home," I said firmly. "Pack your things." She hesitated but didn't argue. I busied myself gathering our belongings, shoving clothes into suitcases and loading them into the car. When I found Jenna's car keys on the counter, I slipped them into my pocket without a second thought. That car was hers, but she wasn't here anymore. It was just another piece of her I couldn't leave behind. As we drove away from Aspen Ridge, I didn't look back. The mountains disappeared in the rearview mirror, and with them, the life we'd shared. The weight in my chest grew heavier with each mile, but I pushed forward, focusing on the road ahead. Back home, I tried to pick up the pieces for Lila's sake, but the house felt empty without Jenna. Every room echoed with her absence, and I found myself avoiding the spaces she'd filled with her presence. Lila, too, struggled. Her laughter was quieter, her drawings less colorful. She missed her mother, and no amount of reassurance from me could fill that void. One day, while cleaning out Jenna's things, I came across a notebook tucked away in the back of her closet. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a collection of thoughts and musings. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries about our life, our marriage, and the struggles she'd felt but never voiced. She wrote about feeling invisible, trapped in the monotony of daily life. She wrote about Aspen Ridge and how it had awakened something in her, a longing for freedom, for something she couldn't quite define. And she wrote about Nathan. "He listens," she had written in one entry. "He sees me. I don't know what this means yet, but it feels like breathing after holding my breath for years." The words hit me like a blow, but they also brought clarity. I wasn't angry anymore, just heartbroken. Jenna hadn't been unfaithful, not in the way I'd feared. She had been searching for something she couldn't find in our life, and she had been too afraid to tell me. A week after finding the notebook, I made a decision. I packed up the house, sold it, and moved Lila and me to a small apartment across town. It wasn't fancy, but it was a fresh start, a place free from the ghosts of what we'd lost. I also sold Jenna's car, keeping only the keys as a reminder of her. They now sit in a small box with her favorite earrings and a few of her sketches, mementos of the life we had together. Lila and I found a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. Grief has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. But we leaned on each other, finding solace in the small moments, cooking dinner together, walking in the park, watching the soap operas Jenna used to love. I even started liking them again, if only because they made Lila smile. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Lila turned to me, her eyes serious. "Do you miss her?" she asked. "Every day," I said, my voice soft. "But I'm glad we had her for as long as we did." Lila nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I miss her too." We sat in silence after that, the weight of her words settling between us. But for the first time since Jenna's death, it felt like we were beginning to heal. Life moved forward, slowly but surely. I found a new job driving for a car service, the flexible hours allowing me to spend more time with Lila. She started art classes at a community center, her sketches growing more vibrant with each passing week. And I learned to carry the memory of Jenna without letting it consume me. In the end, Jenna's story wasn't just about loss. It was about love, imperfect, complicated, but real. And though our time together had ended far too soon, it had left a mark on me that would never fade. I kept moving, one day at a time, carrying her memory in my heart and building a new life for Lila and me. Because that's what Jenna would have wanted, for us to live, to find joy, and to keep breathing, even when it felt impossible.